The Battle of Coronel in November 1914 was one of the first major naval battles of the First World War. It was fought thousands of miles from Europe in the waters of the South Pacific, and was the Royal Navy's first defeat in 102 years. This video is brought to you by CuriosityStream, an online subscription streaming site that offers thousands of documentaries and non-fiction titles from some of the world's best filmmakers. Get unlimited access for just $2.99 a month or $19.99 a year. You can also get 30 days for free at curiositystream.com/historiograph with the promo code Historigraph. The story of Coronel begins months earlier, with the escalating tensions between the world's great powers in the summer of 1914. As war approached in early July, the German East Asia Squadron left its base at Tsingtao in China. Commanded by the veteran Vice Admiral Maximilian von Spee, this small force was charged ordinarily with the protection of Germany's substantial colonial holdings in the Pacific. It was built around Gneisenau and Scharnhorst, a pair of capable armoured cruisers with the firepower to be a match for many of the Royal Navy's equivalent ships. As the centrepiece of the Kaiserliche Marine's biggest overseas station, they also had excellent crews, who had performed exceptionally in gunnery practice. Once war broke out at the start of August, von Spee took his ships deep into the Pacific. With any return to his base at Tsingtao ruled out by Japan's entry into the war, Vice Admiral Spee's objective became to cruise across the Pacific, making as much of a nuisance of himself as possible without getting caught. For the Royal Navy, priority in the Pacific was given to escorting Dominion troops to Europe and seizing as many of Germany's Pacific islands as possible, so in the early months of the war there wasn't an active effort to hunt Spee down. Rear Admiral Sir George Patey's Australian squadron aided in the capture of German Samoa at the start of September, before beginning escort duties on a convoy bound for Aden. On September 14th, Admiral Spee turned up at Samoa, hoping to surprise any British ships still in harbour. The Germans were disappointed to find no targets around and moved off, but not before a wireless station on the island began to transmit their position and course. To throw the British off his tail, von Spee steamed northwest until out of sight of land before doubling back to the east to continue his intended course towards South America and the sparsely guarded British trade routes there. Meanwhile, on the other side of America, in the South Atlantic, a small Royal Navy squadron was being assembled on the River Plate, hoping to hunt down the German cruiser and commerce raider Dresden. Under the experienced Rear Admiral Sir Christopher Cradock, the South American squadron was a distinctly ragtag force. Its two principal ships were the old armoured cruisers Good Hope and Monmouth. Both ships had been less than a year from being scrapped on the outbreak of war, and were crewed almost entirely by reservists. On paper, their firepower was considerable. Good Hope had 2 large 9-inch guns and 16 6-inch guns, but half of these were mounted so close to the waterline that they could not be used at all in heavy seas. Monmouth was similarly flawed, possessing no large caliber guns at all. They were joined by the armed merchantman Otranto, which had only 4-inch guns, and the modern light cruiser Glasgow, which was the only ship in the group to feature a fully professional crew. By mid-September, Cradock was assembled at the River Plate, but Dresden in fact had already passed around Cape Horn and into the Pacific some 2 weeks before, on its way to link up with von Spee. The Admiralty informed Cradock that after reports from Admiral Patey, it seemed likely that the East Asia Squadron was heading his way. As such, the pre-Dreadnought battleship Canopus and modern armoured cruiser Defence were being dispatched to his command. Defence was an important ship to Cradock. She was both faster and more powerful than both of Spee's cruisers and would be a vital asset. But critically for the battle ahead, the Admiralty completely fell for von Spee's ruse at Samoa. The report of his ship steaming away northwest was accepted at face value, and Cradock was informed, situation changed. Gneisenau appeared off Samoa on 14th and left steering northwest. German trade on west coast to be attacked at once. Concluding Spee was no longer a threat to Cradock, the Admiralty cancelled Defence's orders to sail to the South Atlantic. The trouble was, nobody in London thought to tell Cradock this, so for weeks afterwards the Admiral expected to be reinforced by a ship that was not coming. This just left Canopus as reinforcement, another ship worth a lot more on paper than in reality. Built in 1899, this lumbering old pre-dreadnought had 4 12-inch guns, much bigger than any of Speye's ships, but crucially they were very old, with an effective range actually lower than Gneisenau and Scharnhorst. To make matters worse, it was another ship crewed by part-trained reservists and with a propulsion system in serious disrepair, barely able to make more than 12 knots. Viewing Canopus as dead weight, Craddock left it at the plate to await the arrival of the Fence and took the rest of the squadron south to the Falkland Islands to prepare for a voyage into the Pacific. Whilst there, on October 7th, Craddock was informed that Spey had now been seen steaming east to Easter Island, leaving little doubt now of their destination. The Admiralty issued orders for Craddock's force to face the Germans, yet there was still no sign of defence. Incredibly, not only had London not reissued orders for defence to depart after it thought Spey was heading east, it still had not told Craddock that she would not be coming. As if to rub salt into the wound, the Admiralty then established a second squadron in the Atlantic to act as a backstop should Spey evade Craddock's force, and then attach defence to this new squadron under Rear Admiral Archibald Stoddart. This was largely because London, in particular First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill, thought that Craddock's force, including Canopus, was sufficient to deal with the East Asia Squadron. Churchill proclaimed Canopus to be a citadel around which all our cruisers in those waters could find absolute security. To Craddock, Canopus was quite the opposite. Only able to make 12 knots when the Germans could do 20 meant that trying to bring them to battle with Canopus in his squadron would be virtually impossible. Craddock could either fight without Canopus and face likely defeat, or face the prospect of the Germans simply steaming around him and getting a free run at the Falkland Islands. To an admiral like Craddock, allowing this possibility was unthinkable. The British ships left Port Stanley on October 22nd, with Canopus following a day later, given escort duties of the squadron's coal ships. According to the governor of the Falkland Islands, Craddock was totally convinced he was going to his death. On October 26th, he signalled the Admiralty to request that defence be detached to his command, but this was declined and he was reminded that he had a sufficient force to engage the Germans in a signal sent on October 28th, by which time Craddock was outside of wireless range, having crossed into the Pacific. By around the same time, Vice Admiral von Spey and his squadron were at the island of Masafuera, not far from the Chilean coast. When news arrived of British ships rounding Cape Horn into the Pacific, he raised steam, moving initially northeast. The armoured cruisers were kept out of sight of land, and all communications were now done with the light cruiser Leipzig's call sign, to disguise the presence of the rest of the formation. By October 31st, Spey's ships were off the coast of Valparaiso, when they learnt that the British cruiser Glasgow was in port there, having been sent on by Craddock to collect signals from London and intelligence on the position of the Germans. Spey resolved to try and trap and destroy this lone ship by timing his arrival at the port just after Glasgow was required to leave under international law. Captain John Luce of Glasgow preempted this, however. Having heard increasingly loud German wireless traffic over the night of the 31st, Luce decided to get out of port as early as possible on the morning of November 1st, eluding the German squadron. Although as far as Luce was concerned, he had dodged only the light cruiser Leipzig, since all German traffic was using that call sign. In the early afternoon, Glasgow rendezvoused with Craddock and passed on the Admiralty's latest signal. Having now been told that his force was sufficient, and with Canopus trailing a day behind, fixing its engines, Craddock decided to attack the Germans now with what he had, starting with the light cruiser Luce had come close to earlier that day. At 1:30 he signalled, "Spread 15 miles apart and look for the enemy." At the same time, von Spey was bringing his ship southwards, searching for the lone light cruiser he had come close to trapping. Neither admiral at this stage was aware that other enemy ships were in the vicinity. At 4:20 p.m, Glasgow and Leipzig, at the head of their respective lines, sighted each other almost simultaneously. It was soon apparent to the British that both Gneisenau and Scharnhorst were present, putting their squadron at a distinct disadvantage. Craddock could now use the superior speed of his armoured cruisers to retreat towards Canopus, but doing so would have abandoned the armed merchant liner Otranto to the Germans, as she could only make 16 knots. Otranto was a virtual liability against this kind of opposition, and likely would not have been taken into battle if Craddock had expected to meet the entire German force and not just a lone light cruiser. Unwilling to sacrifice his lame duck, Craddock opted to stand and fight, with his speed limited. By 5:10, the British ships had been brought round onto a parallel course to Spey, with Good Hope leading. The distance was 14,000 yards out of range for both sides. For an hour, the two squadrons steamed south as the sun began to drop towards the western horizon. Then Rear Admiral Craddock, aware that his crews were not trained for a night action, decided to force the issue. At 6:18, he took his ships to the maximum speed a Otranto could do and turned towards the enemy. Craddock hoped to exploit an advantage in the light. With the British fleet positioned to the west of Spey, the German gunners would have the sun in their eyes as they tried to range their salvos, while being nicely illuminated by the setting sun themselves. Vice Admiral Spey was alive to this risk, however, turning his ships away to avoid any engagement until the sun had set. The range opened to 18,000 yards, and the minutes ticked by. Eventually, at 6:50, the sun dipped below the horizon, and now the tables were turned. The Royal Navy's ships were now nicely silhouetted against the orange-streaked western sky, while the Imperial German squadron was increasingly hard to see against the dark coastline behind it. Now it was time for Spey to strike. Almost as soon as the sun set, Spey altered course, closing the distance of the British to a little over 12,000 yards. At 7:04, he opened fire, and the Battle of Coronel began. The German gunnery was immediately befitting that of ships which had twice won the Kaiser's Cup for accurate shooting. Within 3 salvos, Good Hope was hit and had its forward 9-inch turret destroyed. This wiped half of the British long-range guns out immediately. Craddock closed the distance. He had to get his 6-inch guns in range to stand any chance. At long range, it was now 1 gun against 16. But even once Craddock could fire his lighter guns, there was truthfully no match between 2 modern German cruisers with crack gunnery crews and Craddock's 2 ancient, poorly designed ships with part-time civilian crews. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau fired 3 times for every British volley, while the lower guns on both Monmouth and Good Hope had to be kept shuttered due to the heavy seas. As the British cruisers were battered, Glasgow tried to offer what support it could, and Otranto dropped out of the line completely, being hopelessly outranged and outclassed. By 7:23 it was getting dark, and the British ships now had only the gun flashes of their opponents to aim at. Still, Craddock closed the distance though, reaching as close as 5,500 yards by 7:35. Fearing a torpedo attack, Spey turned away slightly. Good Hope responded by turning directly towards the Germans, its single large gun blasting away on deck. At less than 5,000 yards distance, the Germans responded again, pouring thunderous broadsides into the British flagship. Just after 7:50, Good Hope blew up and sank, having sustained more than 35 direct hits. Some way behind her, Monmouth lay immobilised in the darkness. At 8:15, Spey ordered his light cruisers to search for the enemy ships and launch torpedo attacks. As it was now properly dark, he was unaware that Good Hope had indeed already sunk. At about 9 p.m, the cruiser Nürnberg came across the disabled Monmouth. Its captain, Karl von Schönberg, paused, illuminating the ship's ensign with his searchlight. The crew declined to lower it and surrender. Schönberg fired warning shots. The Monmouth, as if summoning up the last of its strength, tried to ram the cruiser. After ducking safely out of the way, almost reluctantly, Schönberg opened fire, sinking the Monmouth within a few minutes. As Glasgow and Otranto scattered in defeat, 1,600 British sailors, the entire crews of Good Hope and Monmouth to a man, were dead. Though the reduction in British naval power from the loss of these 2 antique cruisers was minuscule, it was a humiliating naval defeat, Britain's first for 102 years, and a heavy loss of life. It left Spey the master of the Eastern Pacific, and gave him a clear run into the South Atlantic. Spey himself, though, was far from jubilant. Half of his ammunition had been expended with no hope of resupply and no route back to Germany. All he and his men could do was as much damage to the British as possible until eventually they caught up to him. Just a few short weeks later, that's exactly what happened. This video is sponsored by CuriosityStream. CuriosityStream is the best place on the internet to go for high quality documentaries on a variety of topics. For a broader look at the conflict of which Coronel was a part, you should check out Apocalypse World War I, which tells the story of the Great War through coloured footage. You can get unlimited access for $2.99 a month or just $19.99 a year. The first 30 days are completely free if you sign up at curiositystream.com/historiograph and use the promo code historiograph. Thanks again to CuriosityStream for helping to make this video possible.